Hey everyone, I got great news. I finally got all the paperwork for the old Magirus Deutz, so now we can start working on this thing and get it ready to hit the road again. But before I even go further with this, I just want to give a big thanks to all of you guys who have been reaching out in comments and on email and in Instagram and all that stuff, wanting to help out with these papers. Because I've been getting a ton of useful information, not just about this, but also just the German system in general. And some of you have also been sending me some really good and useful stuff related to this truck. So I really appreciate that. And I honestly think it's very cool that it is that kind of community that seems to be gathering around this channel. So I just wanted to let you know that I really appreciate all of you guys watching along and showing such interest in these weird hobbies of mine. That's actually a bit of a funny story, because you might remember a couple of videos ago we went over to pick up that old rusty Unimog 411 at the military surplus store. And knowing the guy over there and that he also deals in these older specialty vehicles, we of course got to talking about that stuff. And that's when I brought up that I had this old Magirus, and he started questioning a bit, wanting to know exactly which one it was. So let him know it was this thing and showed him some pictures, and he went, "Oh yeah, I know that truck. I'm the guy who brought it in from Germany." And then he proceeded to say, "I even have copies of all the old paperwork to prove that." So I told him I would very, very much like a copy of those copies. And he just said, no problem, and I could just have them. And not only is that quite a coincidence, but as we talked a little bit more about this, it turns out that the guy who owned this in Germany, the one who originally bought this off the THW, he's also a Danish guy, and I have met him. He's even in one of the very, very early videos on this channel when we were just filming off-road events, because he was driving in a big 6x6 MAN Cat 1, and he had brought that out to an event where I was driving in my Unimog. So the man himself is not in the video, but his vehicle is. So as one of the other guys over at the store said, sometimes it's just a small world. So that means even if the copies weren't enough, I could have probably been getting in touch with this guy and he would most likely have helped me out with this. But it turns out that wasn't even necessary. I sent this stuff into our tax department and it was more than enough to grant me permission to re-register this thing. So let's just go ahead and get right on this thing, because it's been waiting long enough. And also I might actually need this a bit sooner than I expected. So I think I'm going to divide this first part of the project into a few stages, and probably also a few different videos, because I actually have quite a bit to do, and by now I know that a lot of you are probably going to want to see most of it. So first off, we have to take care of some of the issues that this thing has, mainly that throttle issue. We have to figure out what's going on with that. But also we have some air leaks, we have some stuck buttons and actuators, and also the parking brake is not working, and we have a few electrical issues and probably some more stuff that I forgot. Next up, I want to give this thing a full service, because that probably hasn't been done in many years. So I want to change all of the oils and the filters. I want to take the brakes apart and have a look in there. They're probably not worn, but it would be nice to check that they are functioning as they should. Also go over the steering and all of that important stuff underneath. Not just to make sure it will pass the inspection, but also it's just going to be peace of mind to know that all of that stuff is good and working as it should. And then we have a little bit of body work to take care of. We have some rust up here in the front wheel arches. Also there's some mirrors missing, and then there is this mangled front grille that is really letting down the whole look of this thing. And also there's the cab itself on the inside where the whole ceiling is coming down. We're going to have to do something about that as well. And lastly, we have this box on the back. And I've been making up my mind on this thing, and I'm going to do pretty much what most of you was hoping I wouldn't do. I will empty it out, and then I'm going to cut off the top of this, turning it into just an open bed. But before you start leaving all those angry comments, at least let me explain my reasons. So I know a lot of you were telling me that I should really keep this box as it is, because it looks great, it's well made, and it really suits the vehicle. And I totally agree. It looks really cool like this. Problem is, I just don't have any use for it. Now, some of you were even telling me I could just use it as it was and keep all my tools and equipment and stuff in there as I was going around. But the problem is, I just don't carry that many tools and stuff. Typically, I wouldn't even carry enough to fill out one of these lockers down here. So it just wouldn't make sense to have such a big box for so little. Now, a whole lot of you were also saying that this would make a perfect overlander vehicle and that I should convert this box into a camper. And first of all, I totally agree. I think this platform would be an excellent choice to make an off-road expedition overlander type vehicle. But as for converting this box into a camper, that would be quite a big project for a few reasons. First of all, it's just not tall enough. There is really not room enough to stand up in this thing. So you would either have to make the roof extendable or just make the whole thing taller or something like that. It would be an enormous amount of work. Now, it can be done, I have seen it, but really the only reason you would do that is if you really like the look of this box on the truck. Now, the next problem is that it is just not legal around here to make living quarters in the back of a commercial vehicle like this. Now, it is possible to have it legally converted on paper to being a camper, but it's such a niche thing that the rules don't really take it into account. So it takes a whole lot of bureaucracy and there's a lot of red tape to get through. I know a few people have done it, but not only is it a big headache, it is also massively expensive. And the last thing, which is probably most important, is that I just don't need a big camper. I don't go overlanding camping like this. When I do actually go for a little trip, I don't take up more space than I could fit in the back of my little Suzuki Jimny. Now, initially, I would have really liked to keep this box intact, but at the end of the day, I just don't really know what I would do with it. It has been for sale for a while, but no one seems to be terribly interested. And that's probably because these things are not exactly rare. There was a lot of vehicles built with these toolboxes on the back. There still is. All the fire trucks and stuff, they also have something similar to this. And all of these vehicles are actually not terribly expensive. And furthermore, a lot of them are turned into campers. And for that reason, the boxes are of course taken off. So there's already a ton of these things out there. Some of you suggested I could take this thing off and prop it up somewhere and just use it as storage, and that's really not a bad idea. But at the same time, I do think it is a bit wasteful to take this off and let it rot somewhere, only to then have to build a new bed from scratch. Because it wouldn't just be the flat bed itself. I also have to make new sides and new mountings and new stuff underneath, and it's gonna take a whole lot of time and also a whole lot of money to do that. So eventually I figured, you know what, let's just use what is already on here and just modify it to suit my needs. That way I will at least be preserving some of this original bed, and also it's gonna save me an awful lot of time, and I would really prefer that right now. But before we even start digging into all of that, let's go ahead and see if we can figure out that throttle issue. So I should just say that I haven't done anything to this vehicle since I brought it home. Or, well, we have been firing it up and driven it on the property once in a while just to keep it alive, but I haven't turned a single screw on this thing. So it's still in exactly the same condition as when I drove it here. Now, if you haven't seen the first video where we went out to get this thing, I'm gonna leave a link for that down in the description if you want to check that out. In that first video, you're also going to see a more detailed walkthrough of this and also my initial impressions of it. I can just show you that this sticking throttle has gotten even worse since we brought it home. Now it just stays down like that. You really do have to help it up, and it is pretty stiff overall. Now it could just be the hinge down here on the pedal itself, I don't really know. But I think we're going to start by just tilting up the cap, and we're going to have a closer look at exactly what is going on with this whole linkage. So because this is an air-cooled engine, it's completely enclosed in all of this metal shielding, and that is to direct the airflow out and around the cylinders. But the injection pump is located inside the V, so I'm gonna have to take some of this stuff off. But it is very important that this stuff is on here when the engine is running, otherwise it's gonna run hot pretty quick. Right, so now that we can really see what's going on here, I can go ahead and show you the very long way that throttle linkage has to travel to get to the pump. So of course it starts up here at the pedal, where this is pushing a rod down through the floor. Now that rod comes out right through the floor and into this lever out here in the front of the cab. There's a little ball joint connected right there, so when you push on the throttle, you are pushing this lever forwards. That lever is then connected to another ball joint that moves right into this air cylinder connected right here. Now, if we come in here, we can see the back of that cylinder right down there. And the cylinder itself is part of the throttle linkage. You can see the rest of the linkage is connected to the back of that and continues going backwards. We could just quickly say that that cylinder, that is for the engine shut off. And it's operated with the same button that you use for the engine brake. So when you push this button right here in the floor, you are closing these two valves on the manifolds, and that gives you engine braking. At the same time, it is expanding that air cylinder down there, and that completely closes off the throttle, both to stop you injecting fuel while you're using the engine brake, but also to shut the engine off. But from that cylinder, it then does this little S shape, and then it moves all the way back here, and it ends up in this linkage right here. So as you're pushing the pedal, this is being moved forwards, so it is tilting this lever here. That runs across the engine. It's held in place right here and right in there. So up here in the other end, that is going to be pulling on that other lever that is connected to yet another linkage that then runs into the V of the engine. Now I'm over on the other side of the engine, and you can see our lever right down here behind those fuel filters. So up here in the V of the engine, we have the fuel pump itself, and our rod for the throttle is coming out down here. That runs underneath the pump and eventually connects to the lever on the pump itself. And that actually goes straight through, so you have the exact same lever up here on the other side, which makes it quite convenient and easy to see what's going on. So with the throttle linkage traveling so far from the cab and all the way around the engine and into the middle of it, there is a lot of potential failure points with all those different levers and connections. And we already know that the pedal is sticking, so some of all this stuff is not moving correctly. But let's just go ahead and try something, because we can see this little lug down here on the lever. When this thing is at full throttle, that lug is going to be hitting against this stop right here. And I don't think that's happening. So I'm just going to set the camera up so you can look at this, and then I'm going to go press the pedal all the way to the floor. Okay, so I'm going to press the pedal all the way down. Here we go. That is all the way down. So as you could probably see from that, this lever really only moves about halfway when the pedal is all the way down. And that fits exactly with what I felt when I drove this thing home. It was like I could only ever give it half throttle. Now of course we can't trust it 100% right now because the cab is tilted, so we would have changed the angles of some of this linkage down here. It doesn't change that much, but I would still really like to see exactly what it's doing when the cab is down in place and everything is where it's supposed to be. Now normally that would be really difficult to see, but I just noticed something. Check this out. This has an enormous service hatch in the bottom of the floor of the cab. So you can actually get down to the engine while the cab is down. That's really cool. You don't normally see that when you have a tilting cab, because the tilting cab, that is your access to the engine. But I'm guessing they did it because it is such a big cab and it doesn't actually tilt all that much. On most of these cab over trucks, when you tilt it, it will be almost vertical, so you will have great access to everything down there. But I think we will have to disassemble quite a lot of stuff in here to get to that. Or maybe not. The floor mats are separated right here. And this right here. Huh. Okay, maybe it's not that bad after all. I think we might have to get the passenger seat out, but other than that, I think it's pretty straightforward. That's pretty cool. But before we go ahead and bring this cab down and take out that floor hatch, I would really like to see if we can figure out where this linkage is sticking and why that pedal is so stiff. And I'm just going to do that by starting to disassemble some of all these links on the whole system so we can divide it into a few sections. And then I'm just going to feel them if they move freely. And because this rod here on the back is my main suspect, or rather these bushings that are holding it, I think we're going to start right here. All right, well, the part from here and all the way up to the pump actually seems to work just fine. If anything, the spring or the return spring on the pump is extremely strong. That takes quite a lot of force. But with this part pretty much ruled out, I really want to see how this whole assembly up here with that cylinder is actually working and moving. Problem is, when the cab is tilted, I really don't have a whole lot of space to get in there, so I'm gonna have to lower the whole thing back down to open up this front so I can actually get in there. Okay, so this rod moves freely, and this arm here moves freely, and this little rod up here moves freely. It's only when I try to move the whole thing a little bit more than just wiggling, I can feel it binding. So I actually think the binding is up there at the pedal itself. Yep, I can move this link freely that's at the bottom of the pedal, but the pedal itself takes some force to move. So I really think the binding is just down here in the hinge of the pedal itself. It does look like the hinge pin down here is welded in both ends, so you're not really supposed to take this apart. So just gonna give it a little bit of lube and try to see if we can work it loose. Already feeling a whole lot better. Still a little bit of resistance in it, but of course right now it's still disconnected underneath, so the spring on the pump is not trying to push this back. This doesn't feel bad at all. Well, this feels reasonably smooth now. I don't know if it's even possible to reconnect this joint here without lifting the cap back up. I think I got it. Haha, nice. Oh yeah, that's moving much smoother now, and it returns by itself. So that's really nice. But of course that doesn't really take care of the main issue that I set out to fix. So I think next up I'm gonna see if I can get this big floor hatch out so I can look directly down at the engine and the pump and see exactly what it's doing when I'm pressing that pedal. Is that a golf ball? It needs a good cleaning in here anyway. Alright, so this is actually pretty cool. So I thought I was gonna have to unbolt a lot of stuff to get this passenger seat out, but no. It just has a couple of quick attaches over here, and the other side is just a couple of pins put into some matching holes. So all I gotta do is just release these two pins, and I can lift the whole thing up and just pull it out. Easy as that. That's really nice. But of course there's still some brackets and stuff that I have to unbolt here. You know, maybe I can just take out this one hatch. I might not even need to take both out. There is no good way to grip that. Yes, and right there is what I want to be looking at. Alright, so I hope you guys can see the lever down here on the pump. From here I'm able to push the throttle and look at this at the same time. So I'm just going to push it down nice and slow. Right there, the lever stops moving. Gives a little bit more. I'm still pushing the pedal down. There we go, the pedal is all the way down now. Interesting. Still has quite a ways to go. So we are losing that movement somewhere in this throttle linkage. You know, I just want to try something now that I have access to it like this. So I'm going to fire it up, and, well, I know I just told you that we shouldn't be running it without these covers on, but it's only going to be for a little while. It doesn't overheat that quickly, so it'll be alright. So I'm going to fire it up, and I will bring the pedal to full throttle and see what my RPMs are at that point. Well, I can't see. I'm just going to have to listen for it. And then I'm going to help the throttle lever that little extra bit of way to see if I get that extra RPM that I'm looking for, because I'm pretty sure this is the issue, but it could be something completely different. So let's just try it out. All right, let's try this out. Yep, we are definitely getting that last bit of RPM when I help that throttle the last bit of way. So I was just thinking of something. Remember that I mentioned that the return spring on the pump is really stiff? I could feel that when I was moving that lever on the back of the engine. And I was wondering if maybe it's a bit too much for this cylinder, this stop cylinder right here. There is a spring inside of this, but maybe we are overpowering that and just expanding this cylinder rather than pulling the whole thing along. So I'm just going to set up the camera so you can look at this thing, and then I'm going to press the throttle. Then afterwards I can look at the footage as well, and we can see if that's what's going on here. Alright, so I'm just going to slowly press this down and we'll see what happens. Especially in this last bit of travel right here. Well, looks like that's exactly what's going on here. We are just pulling on that stop cylinder. And that's actually a little bit unfortunate because there's not really any way to increase the tension on the spring in there. Maybe we can slack off the spring, the return spring up there on the fuel pump itself, because it really is very stiff. So I do think maybe we can slack that off a little bit without really compromising anything. Okay, I think we might be getting to the bottom of this, because that return spring down there on the pump, that is not the correct one. That is two different springs zip-tied together. So, the return spring is probably not supposed to be as stiff as it is right now. Now, unfortunately, this spring is not very easy to get to because it is underneath the pump itself. So, I definitely can't film what I'm doing down here, but I am just going to be trying to take it off somehow. Alright, I managed to get this thing out of there. I was able to pry one of the ends off with a screwdriver, and that was enough that I could wiggle it out of there. So I don't really know how I'm going to mount a new spring, but we'll figure that out when we get to it. But I can already tell that this thing, this is way too strong. Oh, yeah, That is way too much for a simple return spring, so we're gonna have to find something thinner, and also preferably one that is in one piece. You're not really supposed to join them like that. So I'm 100% sure that this is not the correct spring for it. Alright, here's what I found. I had a few springs laying around. So one option is to do something kind of similar to what they did, just with some slightly weaker springs. These are almost the same length, so if I pull it out to the same length, it's going to have a little bit of pre-tension on it. And we want that pre-tension because this is still the way you shut it off, is by letting this pull the throttle all the way back. So it needs to be tight all the time. This one actually wasn't. When you let off the throttle, this would collapse completely to the way it is now. It hardly had any tension on it when I popped it off up there. So this one with some slightly weaker springs should work pretty well. Problem is, I'm still going to end up with that joint in the middle. And I really don't want that because these things, they do vibrate on the engine, so they might just wear through each other right here. That's probably also why they gave this one a zip tie. So the other option is this thing. I think this is pretty close to what was on there originally. I don't know the exact dimensions of the original spring, but on the drawings that I have, it looks kind of like this, at least in terms of the size relative to everything else. Now this is quite a bit shorter, but it is also quite a bit weaker, so once again, it will have that pre-tension on it, but it's still weak enough that I can pull it a bit more. Just by hand, I can pull it more than I can this thing, so I think this will work pretty well. But now, the real challenge is going to be getting this thing back on there. I may just have to make some modified tool to hold one end of this, because I don't really want to take all of these pipes up here apart. Alright, so there was no getting around it. I had to take a couple of the injector lines off just to be able to even get my hands down in here. But I don't think that's going to let in too much air. It'll probably still fire up. It's just going to take a little while for these two cylinders to catch up. Anyway, I got that new spring mounted in there, and that looks much better, and the tension feels much more like I would expect it to. So let's just go right ahead and see what kind of difference that made. Okay, I'm laying a little bit weird in here so I can press the throttle and look at this, so let's check it out. Oh yes, look at that. Right to full throttle. No problem at all. This feels much more correct. Nice. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and put those injector lines back on so we don't make a big mess here, and then we're going to fire this thing up and see how it behaves now. Alright, let's try this out, see what happens. I might struggle a bit because we had those lines off. Not bad. Throttle is still sticking a little bit. Well, let's go for it. Yeah, that was definitely at the limit. Awesome. Okay, see if it'll do it. Yep, no problem at all. Nice. However, I'm wondering if that pedal should have had a return spring on it down there on the other side. I don't actually know. It's not uncommon for the pedal to have its own return spring, and this lever right here does have a few extra holes in it, so it might have had one that they took off because it had plenty of resistance already. But I don't really know. I can't exactly tell where it would have attached to. Anyway, it's really not that bad. It might also work itself out once we actually start using that pedal a bit, so I'm just going to leave it for now, and we will get back to it if it turns out to be a problem. But that should be our acceleration throttle issue solved. Not only can we give it full throttle now, but the pedal also feels much more responsive, and it just feels more correct overall. So I'm really pleased with that. And it is kind of funny that these emergency vehicles, they turn out to be just like military vehicles. Even though they have so few miles on them and have been used so little, You can just always find that someone did a botch job of something. But now I can go ahead and get all my tools and mess out of here, and I can put that floor back together. And I think while I have the seat out, I'm probably just gonna clean and vacuum it a bit in here because it seems to be needed. And also there's some stuff I can remove, like old cables that are not used for anything anymore, so I might as well take care of that right away. It looks like someone had a radio in this thing at some point, because we have some ISO connectors here, but no offense, this is a pretty poor installation, so I'm just gonna tear all of this stuff out. Well, to be fair, they did go through the fuse box up here, so it's not that bad. You know, part of me actually kind of enjoys taking out all of this unused wiring from an old vehicle like this. Don't know what they spilled in here, but it looks pretty nasty. Well, that is certainly much better. But this is quite a sidetrack, so let's get back to fixing some of the bigger issues with this thing. Well, I just had to leave this project for a little bit to go do something else, and now that I'm back to it, it is of course raining. Quite a lot at times. Should have known this would happen when I'm working outside. Anyway, the next big problem that this thing has is that the parking brake doesn't work. Or actually, it sort of works, because the whole mechanical part, the whole brake part of the system, that does work. It is the air part of it that is not working correctly. It's located right here under the dash, and when it's down like that, the brake is released, but if I try to pull the brake, it's just letting out a whole lot of air up under the dash. And I think that someone's already been fiddling with this, because not only is the dashboard not held in place as it should be, but also, see if I can film it, and down there in the corner are the 3 air lines that run to and from the parking brake valve, and you can see that one of them has been disconnected, and the line that was supposed to be hooked on there is nowhere to be found. However, that is the line where all the air is blowing out when I try to pull the brake, so I assume that runs to the air release port, but it should probably have been directed outside of the cab. So I could just quickly go over the basics for those who might not be familiar with air brakes. So on a truck like this, you are using a powerful spring to hold the parking brake on. And that spring is located inside a brake chamber. Now typically you would have one of those at each wheel, but because this is so old that it is partly mechanical, it only has one chamber located up under here. So the brake chamber is this right here. Inside of this, there is a hefty spring that is pulling back on that rod, and that runs all the way to the back, pulling on the brake cables. So when we want to release the parking brake, we are filling this up with air, taking the load off that spring, and it will release that rod. And then, of course, when we want to pull the brake again, we just let the air out of this chamber, and that spring is going to take over, pulling that rod once again. But yeah, the problem with this is that the parking brake is released all the time. Or at least as long as there is air in the system. Once it runs out of air, it does pull the brake. So that's why I know that the mechanical part seems to be working just fine. But once it has air pressure, it is releasing that brake. And when I try to pull the brake manually, instead of just emptying out that brake chamber down there, it seems to be letting the air tank pressure out directly through the valve for some reason. It's not even pulling the parking brake when I do that. Even while it's just blowing all of the air out up there, at the same time, it is still holding pressure in that brake chamber down there as well. Now, it's actually a very simple system. There's not a whole lot to it. It does have a few extra lines that runs off, along with some extra valves and stuff. And all of that runs down to the back, because that has to do with the trailer coupling in the back. Because you want the parking brake to work on a potential trailer as well. So it might be some of that trailer stuff that is leaking air running backwards into the system, but I think currently my main suspect is going to be the parking brake valve itself. So let's start by checking that. And now that I'm looking at it a little bit closer, I am sure that someone's been fiddling with this, because someone has marked these lines. I don't think you can tell on camera. They used a pretty dark marker, but they made 1, 2, and 3 lines on the hoses. So someone had these off and wanted to mark them to put them back in the right place. So perhaps they didn't put them back in the right place. Not really sure yet. First thing I want to find out is which one of these ports the air is actually coming out of. I know that one is the one that is detached up there above the dash or under the dash, and that's the one that is blowing out a lot of air. This one is running to number 1 on the valve, so that should be our air running into the valve. And then I assume the last one would be number 2. That should be the one running to the brake chamber. So because the brake is released right now, several of these will probably have air pressure in them. That one certainly does. And so does that one. Just let those run out. I'm just going to mark this also so you can sort of follow along with what I'm doing. I'm going to mark them a little bit differently because they just did 1, 2, 3, probably because they were just counting from out here and inwards. But that doesn't actually fit with the ports up on the brake valve. This is number 1, but this over here is number 3, and this back here is number 2. I'm just going to mark that up here as well. Right. Just going to take this one off as well, even though we know that is disconnected up on the other side. Right, so what I'm going to do now is just simply fire up the truck and let it build some air pressure, and I'm just going to feel which one of these is blowing out some air, because that's the one that is connected to the air tanks and should go to number 1 on the valve. Here we go. This is the one. And that's the one that had number 1 on it, so that is actually correct. And now that the brake is released, it should be letting air out of number 2. And that's exactly what it's doing. But for some reason when I pull the brake, it's still letting air out of number 2 and number 3. What it should be doing right now is open this to let the air backflow out of the brake chamber and run out of number 3 into the atmosphere. It should not be connected to number 1. It's actually really nice that they put all these connections right here in the corner where it's really easy to get to. On some trucks you have to disassemble half the dashboard just to get to that parking brake valve. But with that simple test, I am pretty sure that this thing is the issue. It doesn't seem to close off number 1 when you pull the brake. So let's take this off and have a closer look at it. Wow, this thing is really easy to take off as well. Just 2 bolts and the lines come right out with it. I'm really liking the way they built this truck. Okay, let's go ahead and take this thing apart and see if we can figure out what's going on in there. There we go. It's full of dirt and gravel and stuff in there. Or it's probably rust, but it looks like dirt. I'm guessing that's the problem. Yeah, that's definitely the issue. Look at all the stuff that's on this. The same in here. This spring is just covered in rusty dirt. This might just need a good cleaning, and hopefully it'll work again. It's kind of funny what a difference it makes when it's your own stuff. Like, no one would pay me on my job to stand around and do stuff like this. I would just replace the valve as a whole. But pretty sure it can be fixed just by cleaning out this dirt. It's going to be quite a thing to get that back in there. Well, the inner snap ring snapped, but if I could do this with just some cleaning and a new snap ring, then I'll be well pleased. Click, click. So before I go and fix the valve in place, I'm just going to hook up the lines and test it out. Alright, so we have some pressure, so let's go ahead and try this. Right now it is released, just like it has been all along, so let's try and pull it. Yes, it does exactly what it's supposed to. It's just blowing out that air from the brake chamber, and that's it. There is no more leaks. Sweet. And it did pull the brake. And that releases it. Awesome. Nice. So that is one more thing taken care of. Now I can put all this stuff back together. Right, so with that taken care of and all put back together, the last thing I want to do in relation to that parking brake is that line that is ending up under the dash and has been disconnected, where it's blowing out all of that air. I'm pretty sure it's not supposed to end up under there. I certainly don't want it to, because it is really loud when you let a lot of air pressure out like that. So I'm just gonna hook a line to that and at the very least just direct it outside of the cab. The two other lines are coming out right here, and it does already have a hole for a third line, so I'm just gonna bring it out right here. Just gonna use some of this plastic line. That's probably the easiest way to do this. With this, and that should connect right on here. Give it a little rubber boot up here, and I'm just gonna tie it onto that. Now, I was actually thinking I would have some kind of sound dampener at the end of this out here, but turns out I don't have one right now, so it's just gonna hang out down here and be an open hose for now. It'll be all right. All right, so you might not be able to hear the difference all that well on camera, but I'll certainly be able to hear it. So we pull the brake and release it. Yes, that is so much better. So that is the parking brake all sorted out. I'm pretty happy with that. So let's just jump right into the last fairly big issue with this thing, which is gonna be the lights. Because I know we don't have any low beam headlights, and I also know that something is up with the indicator lights. So let's just go right ahead and try to figure out exactly what lights we have that do work. Now this has one of those pretty weird old German ignitions, so when you push the key in, that turns your ignition on. When you switch to number 1, that is your parking lights or marker lights, and also the rear lights. And then when you switch to number 2, that puts on your headlights as well. And to check those indicators, just going to put the hazards on. Now we do also have buttons for the front and rear fog lights, but I don't have any fog lights in the front, but the button is wired up, so I don't know exactly what it would do. But there is a fog light in the rear, so let's just put that on as well. Right, so we got the indicator over here, that's fine. We got marker lights and headlights? Really? Both of them? Huh. I know those didn't work when I drove this home. It just went dark. It would only have full beam headlights. Interesting. Maybe some of all that fiddling up under the dash and removing old wires and stuff might have just knocked something into place that was not connecting, or may have touched a fuse or something. Ah, well, that was an easy fix, okay. But we're missing an indicator over here. And back here we got taillight and indicator. Indicator, indicator, taillight and indicator. Even the rear fog light is working. There is also a backup light, but that doesn't work. I already knew that. I'm not too concerned with the lighting back here right now because I might have to change it, or at least change the mounts and stuff when I go to rebuild this rear end. But I am just going to check that the stoplight works just to know if there is a connection out here. So I'm going to set the camera up for that and just go press the brake. And let's just try the same with the full beam headlights. Well, maybe this truck is just healing simply from getting some attention, because all that seems to be left to do now is just replace a single bulb in this one indicator. Yeah, that looks pretty dead. Let's try that one. Bam, just like that. Well, this was almost too easy. I really expected this lighting to be a whole ordeal in itself. Okay, so having pretty much just skipped right over the whole lighting part, we can go ahead and get right into bodywork. So we can start fixing up the rust that is in the wheel arches up here in the front. And also I noticed it seems to have a tiny hole coming through one door right here. But that really does seem to be about it, so I don't think the rust work is going to be all that terrible. And we can also go ahead and start modifying this box and turn it into a bed. But I am going to be doing all of this stuff in a separate video, otherwise this is going to be going on for too long. Well, here comes the rain again. Now, I know there are some projects that you would really like to see me working on or finishing, but I feel like I really have to make this thing a priority right now because for some reason I just seem to have to move around a lot of stuff these days, so I really need a big truck like this. But since I am going to be doing some welding and bodywork, that means I'm going to have to repaint at least parts of this thing, so we can start thinking about the whole color scheme on this. At first I wasn't really sure about this blue color, but I think it's kind of growing on me. As for the white parts, I'm not so sure. I can tell that many of these parts were black. All of these black parts, that is the white paint simply just peeling off, so it's gonna have to be repainted anyway. But I don't really know. I think having those parts black might look pretty cool. But I'd really like to know what you guys think. Should we keep this color scheme with the white stripes and all, or should we keep it blue but just with a few modifications, or maybe do something completely different? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, that is going to be it for this video, so thank you all for watching along, and I'll see you in the next one.